In this episode of the Coffee with Philosophers podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by Jonathan Rutledge to discuss the paper that he co-authored with Jordan Wessling, God of Holy Love, which is actually a response to this excellent book by Mark Murphy, Divine Holiness and Divine Action. So Dr. Rutledge comes to us as the John and Daria Berry Postdoctoral Fellow with the Human Flourishing Project at Harvard. His primary research focuses on the nature of divine human reconciliation and a specific emphasis on forgiveness and sacrificial theories of the atonement. Speaking of which, to mention a few of his publications, his monograph, published with Rutledge in 2022, is actually Forgiveness and Atonement. So Christ's restorative sacrifice. So definitely check that out if you're into the atonement and want a interesting perspective. He also just recently edited a book called Paradox and Contradiction in Theology. Super interesting, lots of different paradoxes that it looks like your Christology can have, and how do people wrestle with that? Do you need to embrace contradictions in your theology and so on? So I definitely recommend checking that out. And then also keep your eye out for the T&T Clark Reader in Analytic Theology that he's editing. And that covers like basically every major area of analytic theology. So that should be forthcoming 2024 sometime. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you, Dr. Rutledge, for coming on the Coffee with Philosophers podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me on. I'm really excited to talk about this. The paper that I did with Jordan was I think it was the first officially published co-authored piece that I've done. But it was a lot of fun. And so trying to put my ideas and his together was a really interesting experience. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. Thanks.
Great. And I always start out with the 5-book question. So I'd love to know, what 5 single-volume books would you bring to a deserted island, other than the Bible, if you knew you were going to be stuck there alone for 10 years?
Okay, so I can't have the Bible. Okay. Well, one of the things that I think is really important for me as a philosopher is to have something which is practical, especially if I'm going to be on a deserted island. So something like Bushcraft 101 by Dave Canterbury. I can't endorse this book because I've never read it, but it seems like that would be a good thing to take. So that would be my one practical book that I would definitely carry with me. I have watched occasional YouTube videos of people building, houses out of their, the ground and such, like a hobbit hole. So that seems like a useful skill. I'd also want something that was less focused on conceptual stuff, like I do too often with philosophy, something more visual. And I don't know what book I would take with this, but I did find a cool kids book called The Arts of Visual Encyclopedia that just has like history of greatest paintings, sculptures, photographs. And so something like that, but for adults, maybe. It's a kid's book, but it probably is really informative. And I have 3 kids, so oftentimes I do learn quite a bit reading through these science books with the kids. And that one's like 400 pages, so presumably there's a bit of new interesting things. So that would keep me, from staring at, nature is cool, but it's also kind of fun to see like human ingenuity in other ways. And maybe I could practice my art to pass the time. Because you just said 10 years, so I could last 10 years maybe if I had those 2 things. Then the other 3 are less practical. So I think Wandering in Darkness by Eleanor Stump is one of my favorite philosophy books. I just think that what she does there, she addresses the problem of evil, narrative and the problem of suffering, I think is the subtitle of it. But it's just, 500 something page book that is something you can ruminate on what's going on in those pages, probably for more than 10 years. That's about the amount of time I think she spent writing it before publication. So, and then the other one, my advisor for philosophy was Linda Zagzebski. And I think her Virtues of the Mind for like virtue epistemology is just really, really deep and rich, and something I'd love to sit with for an extended period of time and think about carefully. So I'd want to have something like that with me. And then moving away from the nonfiction, I'd rather have at least one good novel. Some people probably would take all and only novels, and I understand that desire. But so one that I recently read, though I read it on audiobook, and I want to go back and read it through the actual text, is Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I don't know. Have you heard of that book before? Susanna Clarke?
No.
So she wrote another novel called Piranesi, which is incredible. She's a really big fan of the Inklings, so it draws on like the Magician's Nephew from Lewis, and then also has aspects of Tolkien thrown in. But basically, like that book got me hooked on Susanna Clarke's work. And then Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell was her first big book, but it was like 1,000 pages. So I didn't ever want to read it initially, but then I finally caved, and it's really cool. Like magical realism, It falls into that category. So it's just an enjoyable read and well done in a contemporary context. So yeah, those would be my 5 to give you a short.
Right, that's great. Yeah, so you got the bushcraft, you got practical, then you've got the imaginative with the kids' book, then you've got Wandering in Darkness, Virtues of the Mind, and last one, what's the name again?
Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
Okay, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are great.
I guess it might be important to just say, like, it's a little bit of a cop-out to include Eleanor's book, because you said we aren't allowed to use the Bible, and big chunks of that book are Bible, so I'm sort of smuggling in.
Oh, that's a good
workaround. Back door, but so
that's a good workaround. I'm definitely not going to say any book that has scripture in it is eliminated.
Yeah, that's
maybe that'd encourage you. Now it'd be great to kind of get the big picture of your paper on the table. So what's sort of like the big upshot of your paper? And then could you give the audience sort of a sense of why it matters whether the framework, the Agapist framework, is true as opposed to Mark Murphy's holiness framework?
Yeah. So, I mean, the big picture is basically this, that Murphy has this framework that you just spoke about called the holiness framework of divine rationality. And what he means by that is that how we understand God's decision-making process, insofar as God has a process, right? This is sort of analogical language in some ways. We can understand that in part due to God's having reasons of holiness, reasons to act in particular ways that are bound up with what he is as a holy, absolutely holy being. So I'll say more about that, I think, later in terms of what the holiness framework is and what those reasons actually like amount to, the reasons of holiness. In short, Jordan and I basically thought that holiness was such a prominent attribute in Mark's framework that love seemed to kind of get left off to the side. It didn't seem that love was as central as we expect a Christian attribute to be in God's determinations of how God's going to act in various ways. And so even though we had a lot that we loved about Mark's book and Mark's work, we were, eventually dissatisfied that it didn't give a prominent, central enough space for divine love, which is not surprising because Jordan's written this book called, Divine Love, or Love Divine, actually, the other way around,
right.
I think.
Yeah.
And so he has like a really important worked out view in several of the chapters in that book. If Mark Murphy's right, then his chapters are basically the correctness of Mark Murphy's view would entail the falsity of the central theses of those chapters. And so it was important for Jordan, given his own commitments elsewhere, published commitments. But I think it's important just because it's really helpful for us to think about how are we supposed to understand what's going on in the world and what has resulted in the world in light of who God is, right? A lot of people and when you start to say, like, how do we understand how God reasons or what rationality of the divine mind should look like, they'll get a little bit worried. And I think it's right to be a little bit worried, right? That you can get in the mind of God. Like, that's not really what's going on. But nevertheless, a lot of philosophy of religion and argumentation rests on at least some ability to expect divine behavior to be in particular ways. The expectations might be grounded in the nature of God, or they also might be grounded in promises and revelation that we take ourselves to receive from God directly, right? So in either of these cases, you form expectations that seem like they're reasonable, but you also want to have a framework through which you can make sense of them more broadly, right? Like, okay, God tells us he is love. Okay, what does that mean? Well, love has this sort of role in his deliberative processes, something along those lines. So, yeah.
Great. That's a helpful explanation of kind of what we're big picture, what you're up to and why it matters, to try to sort of be able to figure out and predict like how God would act in the world, how God did act in the world on the basis of what we know about God from Scripture, but also just from thinking about what would be entailed if God were fully rational, perfectly rational, and perfectly free. So can you give us, you mentioned it, can you give us an overview of Murphy's holiness framework? There's a lot of details. I actually wrote a review of the book for Philosophia Christi, so, keep an eye out for that. And there's a lot to it, but can you kind of give us the big overview of like the key components of Murphy's view?
Yeah, I can. I mean, the main couple of things that you want to do is he has these understandings of types of reasons. So on the one hand, requiring reasons and then also justifying reasons that people have for action. So that's the one distinction that's pretty central to his account. And the other one is trying to understand what these reasons of holiness are, right? So let's start with the first distinction, justifying versus requiring reasons. A requiring reason is a reason that an agent must act on pain of irrationality, assuming that they do not have adequate reasons to do something else, right? So this is the kind of thing where, so holiness is an easy example of this. So God is holy means that it's a form of status that God has, right? So he's so great in every possible dimension of greatness that he is better than everyone else in all of those dimensions, right? Not just better, but almost of a category of his own. So something along this super exalted status is along the lines of this is what he means when he talks about God as holy. And when God is, if we think of God as a holy being, one thing Mark thinks follows from this is that it's incredibly desirable for us, from our perspective. It would be incredibly desirable for us to be united to this being or related to this being in some way. In any kind of relation to the being would be a positive thing for us. But at the same time, from the divine perspective, because of how exalted God is, it's actually unfitting in various ways for God to enter into relationships with us. So if God has no other reasons available to him except for his reasons of holiness to do some action, like to create the world, to become incarnate, to help us to maintain our existence off into like the eschaton, into heaven or hell. If he only has his reasons of holiness, those reasons are always against him entering into those relationships. Why? Because it's unfitting of him as a holy being to do that. And because he's essentially holy, he always has those reasons, right? He's always better than us in these respects. And so these are requiring reasons because were he not to resist coming into or entering into relationships with us, he would be acting irrationally in this case. So it's irrational for God to create anything on the assumption that he has no adequate reasons to the contrary, if all he has are his holiness reasons. But a justifying reason is a reason that presents you with opportunities. It's a reason that a rational agent may act upon, so long as they don't have sufficient reason to the contrary. And so the way this works out for Murphy is he thinks that holiness reasons are rational, requiring reasons, and love reasons, or reasons of love, are justifying reasons. And he thinks in some cases, in all cases, God has reasons not to enter into various relationships with creation, including being their creator. But in some cases, he has reasons to the contrary, maybe born out of love for those creatures, that allow him, give him an opportunity to override, in some sense, those requiring reasons in the background. So this is his broad framework. God's always got reasons not to engage with us, grounded in his holiness, but sometimes he freely chooses to act upon these reasons of love. And these reasons of love are not requiring, right? He doesn't have to act on these reasons of love. What that says about whether or not he has to be essentially loving is a separate question. The short, brief answer to that, of course, is that Murphy says, no, he's essentially loving because of the intra-Trinitarian love that exists between the Father, Son, and Spirit. So anyway, so that's the Murphy view.
That's helpful. And one point of clarification I have is I believe he borrows this distinction between requiring and justifying reasons from Joshua Gert.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's what I call a dual silo view. That is, it looks like God doesn't have to necessarily weigh up things all considered in along one dimension, perhaps because the reasons of holiness and the reasons of love are in some sense incommensurate or like push in opposite directions. Yeah. But I'm wondering just how, given the strength of reasons of holiness, because they're based on God's status as a maximally perfect being, which for Murphy is the Anselmian being, then how could, on his view, the reasons of love, which are take it or leave it, ever sort of outweigh or if they're not actually being weighed up, is it just the case that he can choose to, because they're totally separate dimensions of value, he can choose to set aside the reasons of holiness and just act on the reasons of love, and he doesn't need to like weigh up an all things considered perspective on what he ought to do?
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit, I mean, you can help me with this. It's a bit of a confusing part of the frameworks generally, right? It's trying to figure out, you have different kinds of reasons, right? Holiness and love. And then if you start to talk about the strength of those reasons, a comparative strength, you might initially think that, well, the reasons of love are always love for some sort of being or created thing, which is below the degree of value of God's self, right? Whatever thing God loves, if it's not God's self, then it's going to be finitely valuable. And so presumably his love is then governed by the degree of love, or the strength of the reason of love is governed by the value of the thing itself. So he would never have a stronger reason to then act in favor of reasons of love for a created thing as he would have to act to protect his own holiness because he is infinitely valuable. So is that a fair sort of quick gloss on what you were just offering?
Yeah, that's one way of stating it. It's setting aside the fact that we don't really get a full-throated justification of the framework itself. He just sort of utilizes it, which in some cases is okay, but it leaves these worries. So that was a fair characterization.
I mean, some of this is also, so the strength of a reason, you might wonder, there's a further distinction between the strength of a reason might be an objective strength or subjective. Like the strength that I give it in my own deliberations is a subjective strength, right? Because I just decide it's weighted, 0.75 or whatever. That, I mean, you might wonder how we're supposed to bring the objective strength of a reason, like what reason. I mean, it's hard to even articulate exactly what that would be. But so suppose we're going into like pure subjective realm, and God has these reasons of holiness, which are important and requiring, and then he has reasons of love, and he just chooses to accord a greater weight to the reasons of love in a particular case. It's not clear to me that that's irrational. What you would need to make that an irrational move would be that, well, the reasons that one has and the strength of those reasons is determined by something other than one's own subjective weights that one assigns them. But if you don't think that's the case, if the reasons aren't governed in that objective sense, they just show up objectively, but their strength is not objective. They just have to be sort of weighed by the agent themselves. Then you could probably get a quick way of understanding how it is that God would be able to go for reasons of love as opposed to reasons of holiness in some cases. I mean, the other part of that distinction that we haven't mentioned is that Murphy does think that God has, in some cases, you'll have decisive reason to do something. So if God has no reasons of love to create and no reasons of moral reasons or whatever other kind of reason you have, to create, but he does have his holiness reasons not to create something, then in that case, he has a decisive reason not to create because he has no justifying reasons to do this thing. So there's no reason that opens up the opportunity for creation for a rational being in that kind of a setup. And so when you look at all the various reasons that you have and you sort of aggregate all together, you can have situations where you might have decisive reason against something. And exactly how this plays out with our later distinctions between like incongruous reasons and improper reasons, which I know we'll probably come back to. That's mine and Jordan's distinction, right? Is an interesting question. And I don't think we've worked it out fully either. This paper is sort of opening up like further dialogue about these things, but it's tricky trying to keep this stuff straight in general. So yeah.
Okay, and then we've mentioned it a few times. So why don't we just clarify what is a framework of action? And then you talk about the framework's explanatory power with reference to Swinburne. So can you sort of talk us through what we have two competing frameworks of divine action, the Agapist framework and the holiness framework. What is a framework? And then what are we looking for to adjudicate between these frameworks?
Yeah. So first, a framework is basically a scheme by which divine action can be explained or predicted, and which applies to the divine being simply because that being is divine, right? This is how Murphy understands what a framework is. And we are happy to just buy that entirely. When it comes to comparing different frameworks, I think of this largely in terms of scientific theories, right? So a theory is as good as its predictions in some sense. Not merely that, but that's at least a good place to start, right? And so in formal epistemology and formal philosophy of science, there's there are various uses of probability theory. And here, this is where Swinburne, of course, comes in. He's a Bayesian. And what you do is you take, different hypotheses or frameworks for divine action, and you just look first at how plausible or really how probable they are before considering some particular data, right? So let's say they're both 0.5 probable, so they're equally probable. In that case, they're both on the table, right? And we look then from the prior probabilities or the probabilities of these hypotheses prior to considering some set of data. And then we look at the likelihood of that data appearing. A likelihood, and this is, if this gets too technical, tell me to slow down, but a likelihood is basically how expected is some particular data given the truth of a hypothesis. So to figure out the probability in these cases, you assume a hypothesis is true, and then given its truth, assess the probability of the data you have in mind, right? And it's really hard to assess probabilities in isolation, but it's much easier to assess probabilities by comparison, especially if you have alternative hypotheses to work with. So what we're doing here is we're basically taking what's called the odds form of Bayes' theorem, and it has basically ratios on, I can't tell which side of the screen I'm on, but basically on the far left side, from my perspective, the far left side is the posterior probabilities. It's the probability of a hypothesis given the evidence you're looking at in the background information, stuff you assume to be true in the background, necessary truths and various other things. So you have the ratio of the posterior probabilities is always equal to the likelihood of the evidence given the various hypotheses times the prior probabilities of the hypotheses. So you take how probable these hypotheses are before considering the evidence, then look at how well they predict the evidence, multiply those things together, and you update and get the resulting posterior probability, how probable it is given that you've now got that evidence. Okay.
The ratio, just correct me if I'm wrong, the ratio, the odds form that you're embracing, if you have like 2 to 1, for instance, then you'll have, it'll be 2 times as likely this hypothesis on top as compared to the hypothesis on the bottom when considering the posterior probability in relation to the probability that the evidence would appear given the hypothesis or how expected it is times the prior probability of the hypotheses. So what's nice about this formulation is you get like a a nice little ratio at the end, right? A nice little sort of number. Is that correct? So that it's easier to see which is the more likely.
Yeah, I mean, basically, you get a nice. It's true, you get a nice number. I mean, we say this at the end of the paper. The actual number you get is artificial to some extent, but the comparison between the two frameworks is really the important part, right? So I can't remember. I think in the end of the paper, I say something like, "Well, the agapic framework is 5 times more likely than the holiness framework." Of course, that's just artificial because we decided to use like particular numbers to compare the likelihoods and the priors and such. And just given that, it turns out that it's like 81 to 16 or something is the ratio that appears. But that's artificial. The main point is if, in fact, the various data that we get does favor the agapic framework at all, then it's more likely, right? However much more likely, that's something you have to deal with later. And it's also worth just saying in this paper, we only look at the theological data, right? We only look at stuff like the fact that the incarnation took place and the fact that creation took place. We don't pay attention to more robustly philosophical arguments like the argument from evil or the argument from divine hiddenness, both of which people might think that Mark Murphy has a better score when you consider those data points, right? So
this was a worry I had. So we can go over the specifics of your view in seconds. So, but before then, that was a worry I had. Is this cooking the books against Murphy? Because I find his holiness framework, especially with regard to divine hiddenness. I mean, it makes sense. God would hide if God has reasons to keep his distance from defective, deficient creatures like us. So can you give me a little bit more? Why did you choose to just focus on the theological data as opposed to the problem of evil, the philosophical data, and the hiddenness problem? Because that seems to favor Murphy. And so again, the worry is you're cooking the books against Murphy or something.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we are. I mean, the short answer is word limit. But the more robust, like helpful answer is, on the one hand, you have to sort of pick what you're going to focus on. And it's helpful to know, like, if we isolate this particular data, this data seems to support one framework versus another. If you want to go and add into the analysis, the philosophical bits, that would take at least the same length, I think, to deal with those particular issues. Because a lot of this, right, it's not straightforward exactly how to think about it. So what's the probability that God would permit gratuitous evil or apparently gratuitous evil, right? Inscrutable evil is the better way to put that. Given that the holiness framework is true, well, it's not exactly clear, like, how to assess that probability in itself, like in isolation, right, as a likelihood. It seems more likely that God would do that given the holiness framework than given like naturalism, you might think. Because if naturalism is true, then God wouldn't do anything because God wouldn't exist, right? So it would be much more likely you'd see these things being allowed in by God than if naturalism were true. So the likelihood would support Murphy. But that's also cooking the books against a naturalist in that case, right? So you have to think about carefully how to state exactly what is the bit of evidence we're looking at, and then how does that compare then to the specific hypotheses. But all of this stuff, I mean, if you read any Paul Draper working through these things, it gets really, really technical, really fast, and would just require a lot of additional detail. And then also how good Murphy does, a lot just depends on how excited you are about various theodicies and things that are on offer, right? So if you think that there's a really plausible theodicy that meshes really well, maybe is even entailed by your theological views or your readings of Scripture, then you're going to think that your response to the problem of evil, or the likelihood of like this particular type of evil, is not really undermined per se by its presence, right? If it predicts that the evil would occur, then it's going to be it's just going to be evidence for the view rather than against it, right? So all of those sorts of things to say. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I just thought of a friendly amendment. If if you're open to it. So I was thinking,
Yeah.
well, the way that Murphy's framework shines the most and why it's even sort of relevant in the first place is because Scripture itself describes God as holy. And why I found his book really important and satisfying a gap in the literature is because Scripture describes God as holy, holy, holy. And yet, when you look in the philosophical landscape, analytic theology, philosophy of religion, you don't really see much emphasis or much development on God's attribute of holiness. In fact, he references Otto's classic work, The Idea of the Holy or something, from like 1923 or something. So there's this huge gap. So one thing you might say is we focus on the theological data because where Murphy's view is supposed to be the most relevant in terms of filling a lacuna is not the philosophical data, but is in terms of the theological data, because that's what originally motivates him going into this whole holiness framework in the first place. So I don't know what you think really about that. I just offer that as
I take your amendment entirely. No, I think that's good. One thing that's worth adding, though, so for our view, it's so if you only think that God has requiring reasons of love, spelled out the way that someone like Eleanor Stump or Marilyn McCord Adams is, well, Adams, I think maybe is not quite in that sense fitting the love framework as he puts it. But we take there to be reasons of holiness. We just spell them out in terms of divine self-love. And so fundamentally, why does God act in order to, like, in any way that appears to be a self-interested way, and not entering into relationships with other things? Well, it's out of love for himself. And that's because he's in fact an infinitely great being. It would be very odd for him not to ever have any sort of self-directed love. And there are like scriptural precedents for corollaries at the human level, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, you can't really love your neighbor very well if you don't take care of yourself. I understand there's like a relatively controversial biblical scholarship around like how to understand what's going on here, and as well as philosophical work. But we want to ground the holiness itself in love. And since we think love gives requiring reasons to God, then any of the holiness reasons God has, which are bound by that love, have to be requiring as well on pain of consistency. So we actually take both parts of the framework, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah. Could you explain that? This was another little worry I had. So you have requiring reasons of love as the primary, and sort of the holiness reasons kind of come out of that, or are not reducible to, but are flow out of that, let's say. Yeah. And they're requiring as well. So you said on pain of irrationality. I was thinking, why not just flip Murphy's script? That is, Murphy thinks reasons of love are justifying, and then reasons of holiness are requiring. Why not say that reasons of love are requiring and reasons of holiness are justifying? So could you explain a little bit more about why you guys kept them both at the level of requiring?
Yeah, I mean, we actually, the first version of this paper had the flip, where we had justifying holiness reasons. But I mean, I can't remember exactly how we got here, but what I do remember is I really wanted to push Jordan on this, because it just seems to me that there's something right about treating holiness as a requiring reason. It seems to be something which is bound up in the divine nature, and something that I agree with Murphy on is that he put his finger on that Scripture, time and time again, not just in the Hebrew Scriptures, but all the way even into Revelation, you see holiness coming up as a central attribute of who God is. And so I thought it was important to maintain the requiring reason, the nature of the reason there. But then if we didn't switch the love reasons to requiring reasons, we'd be leaving out what we also take to be a central revelation of the New Testament, which is that God's deliberative activity is fundamentally, all that we see is fundamentally out of this love for everyone. So the way we tried to, thread the needle or whatever was say that, well, yeah, okay, holiness is about status and God acting out of some sort of desire to, maintain that status. And that seems like a type of self-directed love that God's acting on. Oh, well, that's a reason of love. So that's sort of like the easy sort of stream of thought way we got there. Though, of course, like the details get tricky here. I mean, we actually fill out the view more and more as you keep going, even after, the section 2 is where we start to spell out a little bit of what our view is. But as you look at the various data that we consider, like the fact that God created, it seems like that's something that doesn't fit well with the holiness framework. It's not expected. God's default is to not create on that view. On our view, it's not his default not to create. It's completely open to him to do that. And part of the reason it's open to him is because he has requiring reasons of love, which make it available to him. But you have this immediate sort of conflict actually at the point of creation. Like that's the interesting part, is trying to figure out like, okay, well, was it necessitated that God create, or was it actually a free choice? And we offer 2 models at that point of the paper to try and explain how it might work. My preferred model is actually the view that God had basically reasons of self-directed love, aka holiness reasons, to not create, and they were requiring, and he had requiring reasons to create creatures in general. They were sort of counterbalanced in terms of their strength, and he was free to choose between the 2. And then when he chose to create, it essentially the sort of role relationship to the created things shifts into something analogous to the parent-child relationship that we introduce in another part of the paper. And then the requiring reasons of love basically become, towards the creatures that have been created, become more demanding in some sense, right? It seems like it would be improper then for God, even out of self-interested holiness reasons, not to make a way for, say, creatures to be able to reach their flourishing end in him, right? Which is just broadly speaking a part of the Christian tradition early on. I mean, the best known quote on something like that we find our end of God is going to be like the Augustinian thing, right? My soul is restless until it rests in you, like that kind of stuff. But you get this notion of union with God as the end of humanity throughout. It also makes sense of any atonement, of what's going on there, that the atonement is aimed at one-ment, right? Union. So anyway, all of that to say, it is like tricky to try and thread the needle and put together the love and holiness framework in such a way that God has requiring reasons that at least at certain points might conflict, like the creation case. But once you get that initial counterbalance reason point and then have creation take place, then the heavier feature of the love reasons themselves, I think, falls into place in at least a lot of the cases, and then lends more credence or a higher probability to the predictions of the love or the agapic framework at that point.
Okay. That was a helpful explanation. Let me try to make sure I'm tracking, and maybe this will help the audience as well. So on your model, there are requiring reasons of holiness that are self-directed, given God's status as maximally perfect and, perfect and maximally great and so on.
Yeah.
So those holiness reasons are rooted in reasons of love, because on your view, reasons of love come out of the intertrinitarian love between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And there can be a situation like whether God should create at all, where these 2 reasons are requiring. That is, he has reason for the good of creatures to extend the love that's within the Trinity for the good of who he might create. And then he has reasons of holiness to not create, because in some sense that would be like against his status to create things below him. So am I tracking that? And then also,
that's right.
I guess my worry would be, how would they ever be on par? Because wouldn't reasons of holiness always be weightier?
Well, again, so this goes back to one of the first things we talked about, which is how do we talk about strength of reasons here? We talk about strength of reasons at various points. So let me just give you a view I think is plausible independently of whether we represent it there in the paper, which is something along the lines of God has the reasons and then he determines the weight. I do think that that's plausible in some sense.
Okay.
Given that, he says, well, look, I have a reason against it. I have a reason for it. What do I want to do? And then the reasons of love that he has subsequent to that are still reasons out of love for the creatures, but now that they've been created, the reasons take on a new form in some sense, right? They almost are there. There's a sense in which there's more weight to the reasons because of the new relationship that he bears to these creatures. And I'm hesitant to say that he has moral obligations the way that a parent certainly has moral obligations to their children, right? To like give them opportunities to flourish within, various reasonable constraints that God would not have because of his omnipotence and such. So I don't really want to call them moral reasons just because it's unclear exactly how morality would apply to God, but they have something of that strength to them, I want to say, after the point of creation. And this is this might be a place where Jordan wants to take it a little bit differently. And that's fine. Because, honestly, I'm still thinking about these things quite a bit. But the goal, right, going back to the big pictures, the goal is to try and find a way to make sure that we can say that God is loving essentially, not just intra-Trinitarianly, but also ad extra. And then, or in a way which flows out of his intra-Trinitarian love ad extra when he creates, and then also maintain a requiring status of the holiness reasons. So, because like I said, we think that Murphy is onto something important here. And then if you get both holiness and love reasons, then you actually, this is taking us back a step. But when you start to look at the problem of evil, problem of divine hiddenness, you now actually have the resources to respond in almost the exact same way that Murphy does, right? At least you can make use of the holiness reasons at that point. Depending on like whether or not you decide to work it out as like an improper versus an incongruous relationship that God would be entering into. So you've got self-interested love and other interested love both playing into his decisions at that point. Whereas on like Eleanor Stump's view or Marilyn Adams' view, maybe it's all other-centered love reasons and only those that seem to be coming into play.
Okay. Yeah, so that's helpful. This is sort of a hybrid model or combining the best of both worlds in a sense and doing it in a way that recognizes that this is actually what we find in Scripture. Yeah. And so now, Murphy, there's a symposium. So your guys' paper was in the Journal of Analytic Theology, and I just read a little bit of Murphy's response to you guys. Yeah. So you'll have to forgive me if I get this wrong, but I think what he says at this point is that reasons of love based in inter-Trinitarian love that would flow out toward the creature to have union with them and for their flourishing could never be requiring, because the reason God is maximally loving is based in Anselmian features. That is, God possesses all the great-making properties, maximally to greatest possible degree. So he says he's not moved by the idea that these reasons of love could be other-directed in a way that would ever necessitate creation, for instance, because we're not maximally loving. We're not maximally great. We're not. So he thinks he thinks that status difference between the Anselmian God, which he argues is also the God of Scripture, that God is so distinct from us broken, fallible creatures that's why the reasons of love are always justifying. They can never be requiring.
I mean, this comes out of his other book, right? God's Own Ethics, where essentially what he wants to say is that everything which is created has extrinsic value rather than intrinsic. And the only intrinsically valuable thing is God's self, right? And so that means he denies, right, that humans are intrinsically valuable. And when people hear that, they're going to be like, oh, that's like abhorrence. Why would you say that? Some people might hear that, right? In fact, it's a very traditional view in a lot of ways. He's not saying that humans are not valuable. He will acknowledge that they're very valuable. It's just the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic value. I actually use this in my book for Forgiveness and Atonement because I think he's onto something that's right here through some of the influence of Zagzebski when I was there at OU. But so the distinction is basically this, that all things which are good because they reflect or participate in the goodness of God. And so the location of the value of a particular object is what's indicated by intrinsic versus extrinsic. In itself, the only thing which is good in itself is God. Everything else is good in God. Good insofar as it participates with or reflects God, so it has extrinsic value. The location of the value of all creatures is in God, not in the creature itself. That's the distinction that he makes there. But that's basically the reason he thinks that you couldn't have requiring reasons of love, because the value itself is not located fundamentally in the creature. It's derivative of God's value, right? So, I think that one thing that I haven't quite untangled here is there's a wrinkle in the reasons of love question, which is the reasons that we have to love something are not based on comparative value itself, right? In some ways it's a chosen valuing, right? Which is maintained on our model if you take the counterbalanced reasons of creation. So it's still chosen. But given that it's not comparative, it doesn't seem like the fact that God is maximally good and so much better than us is a reason for him not to have those reasons of love, right? The reasons of love aren't grounded in that comparison to begin with. They just are chosen from the start. And so the reason that Murphy offers to undermine the idea that they would be requiring reasons is something which is just not present when we're considering whether or not to love something, whether or not to act as a way of loving. And so you might think that the choice to love is, in fact, the initial choice to love other creatures or love oneself is the point at which you are deciding whether or not your reasons for love are going to be requiring after that, subsequently, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, you're saying Murphy's considerations are downstream from the initial decision by God whether, and you're invoking sort of a subjective thing again, right?
Yeah,
like God can assign the weighting to the reasons. So God does that, but at the moment of doing that, assigning the weighting to the love and holiness reasons, God isn't doing that, or at least the reasons of love. God isn't doing that at the time as a way of comparing himself. He's not saying, I'm going to love these creatures because, he's not saying, how are these creatures lovable given that they have X, Y, and Z properties, and I have, these properties maximally, but I'm going to choose to love them anyway. And I think you say that in the paper, it would be defective of reasons of love if it was comparative.
Right.
Like, I'll only love you if you have these sort of properties or this sort of value. That makes you worthy of my love. And in that case, if you're thinking of love comparatively, then yes, Murphy's considerations would would show that these reasons could never be requiring. Because the comparison between the value of God and the value of us is so massive. The gap is so massive. But you're saying, no, they're not comparative. At the moment of decision, whether to act on reasons of love and how to weight them in comparison to self-directed reasons of holiness, God is taking into consideration what?
Okay. So the way that it goes is if you start early on, right, prior to creation, what are the reasons before God regarding whether or not to create? He has a reason of love that's self-directed. Either that is a justifying reason to act or it's a requiring reason to act. I think Murphy will say it has to be a requiring reason. But the difference is we're emphasizing the love aspect of that versus he's emphasizing the holiness aspect. So the holiness aspect is bound up with the status and gives you this sort of feel of a strength of reason relevance. For us, the strength of the reason is, or at least for me, I should say, I shouldn't speak for Jordan. For me, the strength of the reason is actually not as relevant. It's just that it is a reason. He has a reason not to create out of self-love. And it's requiring because it's sort of like necessarily there for him given who he is, right? All of us have reasons of self-preservation or something which are requiring reasons. They're analogous to a self-love reason. But also because of his love and desire to share that love, sort of diffuse it, let's say, right? And you have the language of diffusive love throughout the tradition. That's also a requiring reason, which he has essentially as a part of his nature to create something. And that is an other-centric love, right? And both of these kinds of things are certainly bound up in the idea of intra-Trinitarian love, whatever that's supposed to be, given like the oneness and threeness involved in that. So the idea is he has reasons of love at the beginning, which both are requiring because they flow out of who he is by nature. And if they switch to justifying after making that decision for other-centered love rather than self-directed love in God, then all of a sudden the sense there's a bait and switch. Oh, I thought the reasons of love were supposed to be requiring reasons, but now after creation they're no longer requiring; they're now justifying, right? Just for consistency's sake, they have to maintain their requiring status, I think. But what does change is that not only is God choosing to continue to act on these reasons of love subsequently, like when Murphy says this, he basically says, well, they're justifying to begin with, and they're continually justifying subsequently. I think he's onto the same sort of issues. Like, to be consistent, however those reasons come into play at the beginning, they have to be maintained in that, have that same status as justifying or requiring off into the future. Otherwise, you have an inconsistent framework.
Now I thought, because we've talked a lot about creation, maybe we could apply your view to the incarnation and the atonement, which are two things you approach and compare and contrast with Murphy's view on how they predict the incarnation or how they predict the atonement. Could you give us a rough sketch of those and why you think your view sort of comes out on top?
Yeah. So this is pretty easy. So Murphy agrees with us that the default position of God, given the nature of his requiring reasons of holiness on the holiness framework, predispose God to not become incarnate, to not create anything, to not atone for sin, especially because sinful creatures, you might have thought it was already bad to become a creature, but now it's even more unfitting to become a creature that is, now suffering from the results or consequences of the fall and sin. And then I'm missing one, and then also divine humility is our other one, that God certainly acts in ways which exhibit humility, which is not particularly fitting, you would think, with a divine holy being on Mark's framework or Murphy's framework. So he agrees that the default on at least the first three, set humility aside, on incarnation, atonement, and creation, are against God entering into those relationships. For us, I think creation is not a default, but non-creation is also not a default, given the counterbalance reason. Like, God could go either way. It doesn't predict. There's no default in that case. So because the default in the creation case is for God to not create, the fact that we see a creation before us is data in favor of our position, because you would expect the likelihood to be lower given the holiness framework, right? When it comes to the incarnation, something is very similar. Again, the default on the holiness framework is to not become incarnate, to not enter into an intimate relationship with this finite, not so great by comparison creature. But for us, God has reasons of love that are aimed at these sorts of things. So it's, again, less surprising. It's not that it's guaranteed or predicted by our model, but it's not predicting the opposite of what we see. And in virtue of that, in all of these cases, it favors our model to look at the data that we have, that Christ became incarnate, atoned for sins, or at least entered into suffering on our account in atoning for sins. Like, all of those sorts of things are things which are consistent with divine love on our framework. And because we take these to be requiring reasons, it sort of cancels out the default nature of holiness reasons, even though we have holiness reasons built into our framework as well. So all of those things give us a predictive power in the theology cases that are lacked by Murphy's view. Let me bring in one of the big points in favor of Mark's hypothesis. Especially, so we think that, not we as in me and Jordan, I think human beings, Christians broadly, find it really remarkable that God would deign the greatest being of all well, the greatest being, of course, is a misnomer here. The greatest thing or whatever that exists has actually become human, right? That strikes people as really crazy and shocking. And what Mark does is he looks at the experience of us being shocked by this and says, oh, you are seeing that there's something which is unfitting about this. That experience of a misfit between God and humanity is evidence that there's something wrong with this great being related to this finite thing, right? What we're trying to do is we're saying, okay, we acknowledge that we have this experience. We're trying to privilege God's divine actions rather than our reactions to divine action as the data. So it might be the case that it's unfitting, and we can accommodate that experience to some extent insofar as we include the divine holiness reasons in our assessment of what happens. But we're also trying to just account for the fact that God did become incarnate. God did atone and did all these particular things as a matter of the data. And the way that, because we don't have the default towards holiness alone in our setup, that's why we end up getting better predictions on the actions of the divine themselves. But Mark really leans in heavily to our experience of those actions as being unfitting in some sense. And then I think it's good reason to think that holiness is a part of the story. I don't think that it gets us the whole story by itself.
Okay, and that's a good point, because this was a point in favor of Murphy's view. He preserves the strangeness of God becoming incarnate, God creating it all, God atoning for our sins. Whereas your view sort of makes sense that God would do these things because God has these other directed reasons of love. So I think that was one of the points he mentioned in his response to you was you're not accounting for the oddness or the strangeness because it just sort of flows out of reasons of love that he would do the thing, and you don't get that unexpectedness.
Yeah. No, he says exactly that. You're right. But again, I think that what's going on here is like we can predict the strangeness. It's just not as strange on our model as it is strange on his model, right? It's more strange.
Have the reasons of holiness. Yeah.
God still has reasons not to do this. We can recognize that, but we also recognize that his love is clearly what he's acting on. And then, whether or not those love reasons, in some ways it seems like a minor difference, but in when it comes to the love reasons God acts on, our model just predicts that better because they're requiring. They're always there. They're not sort of waiting for God to decide to act in that way. Exactly in the same way that Murphy has them as justifying reasons. So
help me. You took on board the distinction between justifying and requiring reasons, such that a requiring reason is you, on pain of irrationality, you have to act on it unless there's contrary considerations to the contrary. So you almost have to say that the reasons are equally balanced. So that might be another worry, is to say you've sort of baked into your view the idea that the reasons are equally balanced, but we don't know if they're equally balanced. In fact, there might be a good reason to think the reasons of holiness are weightier. And if that's the case, then God couldn't act on the requiring reasons of love in the face of these contrary reasons, which are reasons of holiness that are many cases going to be weightier because they're based on God's status as opposed to the intrinsic value of us creatures.
Yeah, assuming that my subjective way of weighting these things is ruled out, right?
I Well,
You might worry about
yeah,
that. Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm entirely on board with that, but that's at least my inclination for these things. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't commit myself to that view in print yet. If I
right.
had an
And
opportunity.
you might think you might not want to go the subjective route. It does handle the worry, but you might think that because at least in the paper you endorse Wessling's view of love as rooted in the intrinsic value of humans, which you may or may not be on board with.
Yeah.
But then there's some sense in which it's objective, like we either are intrinsically valuable or we're not, and we're either intrinsically valuable to a certain degree or we're not. And it would be sort of arbitrary for God to say, well, you are intrinsically valuable, but today I weight you as 0.4 or, something like that.
Yeah.
So then that would be like, no, the real reasons are objective. And then, what about the worry kind of that I just mentioned?
I mean, we do speak to this a little bit, right? So this is coming from Jordan rather than me, but he mentions that maybe the rule is something like this, that something with a sufficient throw out intrinsic. I actually think so long as we have value of either intrinsic or extrinsic value, either type, that can actually motivate what we need. But so Jordan says, look, so long as creatures have value up to above a certain threshold, that's sufficient for reasons of love to be operative for God for those particular things. So he suggests that because we're trying to avoid the comparative, non-comparative issue, he just wants to say like, okay, there might be some value which is sufficient for you to then have a reason of love for acting in some particular way with respect to that thing. But the value of the thing under question is not what determines the strength of the reason. It just determines whether or not there is a reason to begin with.
Oh, I see.
Does that make sense?
Yes. But then,
so like
and
earthworms, maybe, you don't go for that.
And then how would you relate that back to the worry that in order for God to just choose between these reasons at the point of creation, whether he's going to act on the reasons of love or the holiness reasons, that they have to be equally balanced so that God can rationally choose between them without being irrational.
Yeah.
So can you explain that, how that relates?
Yeah. I mean, so I can't do it well, but I'll try. I mean, so I think it's something like this, that God has reasons of love that are directed at particular types of creatures that are requiring, but like take the earthworm. So assume the earthworm falls below the value threshold, which is sufficient for a reason of love. Nevertheless, earthworms and various other parts of our ecosystem probably bear some relation to the things which are sufficiently valuable that God has reasons of love to act for. And so there might be an instrumental value in creating these other things, so God would not operate in terms of the reasons of love that are extrinsically valuable, right? So a lot of creation might in fact just be instrumentally valuable insofar as it aids God's extrinsically valuable ends, including supporting humanity in various ways. But you have to spell out the difference in terms of reasons. So he might have practical reasons to do things one particular way, but the reasons of love are grounded in this extrinsic or intrinsic value of creatures.
Okay.
And only of some creatures, right? Maybe all creatures, but that we leave open. We don't make this as strong a claim as saying that all of creation is extrinsically valuable in a way which is sufficient to ground reasons of love. We would say that it's all intrinsically or extrinsically valuable in something like the participatory value sense, maybe, but only certain things are sufficiently valuable that reasons of love come on the table for God with them.
Oh, okay. And then once they're on the table, you want to say it's the subjective thing.
Yeah, I do.
God can choose to weight them however.
Yeah, that's right. It's an opportunity for him to make a decision. But it's also important to notice, like, these are still requiring. So I think one thing that took me a while to get my head around is whether or not God could have requiring reasons which are opposed to each other. But a requiring reason is a reason that were you not to act on it, you would be deemed irrational, right? You have to act on it on pain of irrationality unless you have reasons to the contrary. But what are those reasons to the contrary? Justifying or are they requiring reasons? They could be either. In which case, if you have conflicting requiring reasons, that just means that, at least in this particular case, if you didn't have one or the other of the reasons, then you would be irrational for not acting upon the reason that you still have. Right. So it's the fact that there are conflicts in your reason doesn't entail that one reason is rationally requiring and the other is rationally justifying. Anyway,
right.
I like keeping that straight because oftentimes I can get back in my head about these things and start to sort of regress, I think, in keeping those things straight. So anyway, sorry.
That's helpful.
Thanks.
That's helpful. And then the last thing I thought we could talk about is just circle back around to the start of Murphy's book. Because you mentioned it, you mentioned the fact that Murphy's really rooting his view of holiness in the experience of holiness, which he borrows from the Otto view. Why this is relevant, I think, is that there's two aspects to the experience of holiness. One he calls the tremendum, which is like the experience of fear and like you're in the presence of this holy being and it's repelling. It's like you want to get away from God because you're in the presence of this thing that you're not fit to be in the presence of because you're so defective and deficient. And then there's the fascinans part, which is the fascinans
in some ways.
Yeah, so this is what I was going to ask you about, what you thought about this. So the fascinans is like the desired, because that being is so awesome and amazing, you also at the same time desire to unify with that being. So you have this
good for you
pull in the experience of the holy for Otto, and then Murphy picks it up, but then he drops the fascinans part. Which is the if we just think of it in terms of repulsion is the tremendum. You're trembling, maybe, and fear is a way to mnemonic device. And then your fascinans, you're not repelled, you're impelled, or you're pushed toward it. So Murphy just drops the fascinans part, and I find that interesting, and I think there's worries with that. I haven't fully thought about it, but I thought I'd just run by you what you think, and this might be a good place to sort of wrap things up, because it goes right back to the start of his book.
Yeah. I mean, this is great. I mean, I think the fascinans part especially is found when you're starting to talk about the idea that we are oriented towards God as our end, right? This union with God motif. Because the idea is that it's actually good for us, even though it's terrifying because it's clearly unfitting in some sense. We're out of our depth in the face of, the perfectly holy being, to put it lightly. Despite that, the fascinans is saying that even though it's terrifying and unfitting in some sense, it's also the best thing for us. And that's why it's so desirable. Or maybe the other way around. If we're talking with Otto, the experience, the desiring of being in fitting relationship with this being is what is evidence that it is good for us, right? So I take it probably I would naturally think of it the other way around. We desire it because it's good, but he probably thinks it's good. Maybe he would agree with that. So just set that aside. But ultimately, I think you lose the relationship between the divine being and the created beings in some sense if you lose the fascinans and just focus on the holiness, the tremendum of holiness. So maybe that's part of it, is we're trying to do something to give us both.
That's where I was
That's a really interesting point. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. That's really true.
I found it weird. I was like, where did the fascinans part go as I got further in the book? And I would love to hear from Murphy why he dropped it. But because then the worry, really, I guess one worry is that by dropping the fascinans, of course you can play up the unfittingness, and then of course you get all this the reasons of holiness to like not or default not enter into a relationship, not create, not incarnate, not atone. So, but if you have the fascinans, then that is like glue. That is there's not only a repulsion, but there's an attraction, and that's pushing in the opposite direction. And maybe that's a way of saying what you're doing, like you suggested, like you're bringing back in the fascinans part, and in a way that makes it robust or makes it make sense within the context of holiness. And you get both parts, which is the full experience of holiness. So maybe you're offering, this may be another way you're refining the hypothesis. You're offering Murphy the full-throated holiness framework, so to speak. That is, I mean, it's not fully
we should write this
holiness framework
at some point.
But it's an integration that does justice to the experience of holiness, which is what got Murphy started in the first place. And then he refined it, but then he dropped it. So you're bringing it back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, another way to put the point that you're making might be just to say that, look, what Murphy does is he doesn't go anywhere in explaining why we might be fascinated with the divine, the holy being. Like, why do we have this fascinans experience in play at all? Given how he treats all holiness reasons, it seems like God's so awesome. Why would anyone want to be related to God? Well, because there's this other side to the experience. Well, one way to work that out is to say the other side of the experience is undergirded by divine love for the creation, which, given what we were just talking about regarding instrumental and intrinsic or extrinsic value, might not be super comforting for the earthworms among us, but at least for the beings which meet the threshold of sufficient value for reasons of love to be operative, would be a way to ground that fascinans component to it. So, or at least motivate why you would have that experience in the first place, right? He's done plenty to motivate why we have the resistance case, but hasn't done much to motivate why we would be interested and desire the holy being as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's great.
That.
That's really cool.
Good way of putting
that's really cool. Okay, good.
All right. Yeah, well, Dr. Rutledge, thank you so much for being on the Coffee with Philosophers podcast. Where can people best sort of follow you, track your work? And
yeah, I mean, I have a Twitter, but I don't really do much there. The best thing is probably just to go to my website, jonathanrutledge.com. It's a little WordPress site, and I try to update it periodically. You can also go to the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University, where they actually update the website better than I do and more consistently. So you'll probably find more there, and my awesome colleagues that are doing interesting work on human flourishing and value and that sort of thing. So those would be the best spots. Or you can always shoot me an email at jonathan_rutledge@alumni.baylor.edu. So feel free to reach out to me if you have questions or whatever. So.
Great. Thank you so much. And keep pressing into Murphy's work. There's a lot we didn't cover. And I recommend checking out their paper. It's at the Journal of Analytic Theology. And then you can see the whole symposium on the book. But they produced an amazing paper. And I thank you again for coming on and sharing it and working through some of these ideas.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks so much, Christopher.